Ethan Cole had been unemployed for 11 days when he turned off the highway and onto a narrow road bordered by fields that seemed to stretch farther than his entire former commute. He checked the address twice before pulling into Mercer Farm. The place was larger than he expected, but nothing about it looked polished for visitors. A weathered farmhouse stood beyond a gravel yard, with a barn farther back and rows of late-season crops disappearing toward a line of trees. Ethan parked beside an old pickup, climbed out, and immediately regretted wearing sneakers. A man came around the side of the barn carrying a coil of hose over one shoulder. "You, Ethan?" "Yeah. I'm Caleb Mercer." They shook hands. Caleb was taller than Ethan, broad from work rather than a gym, dressed in faded jeans, work boots, and a dark long-sleeved shirt pushed to his forearms. His expression suggested he was already evaluating whether Ethan would last the week. Ethan had the same question. 3 weeks earlier, he had managed transportation schedules for a regional distribution company. Then came restructuring, a meeting that lasted 9 minutes, and a cardboard box containing the contents of his desk. Now he was standing on a farm answering an online listing for temporary help. "The guest room's in the house," Caleb said. "You can stay there while you're working. Saves you driving back and forth." "Temporary arrangement," Ethan said. Caleb glanced at him. "That's what the listing said." "Good." Ethan needed that understood. He carried his bags inside, left them unopened beside the guest room wall, and changed into the oldest clothes he owned. 20 minutes later, Caleb had him moving stacked irrigation supplies from beside the barn. Ethan discovered almost immediately that being reasonably fit did not mean he knew how to work on a farm. By the 4th load, his shoulders burned. By the 6th, sweat had soaked through his shirt. Caleb watched him wrestle with another bundle. "You can take half." "I've got it." "You're carrying it wrong." "I said I've got it." Caleb's mouth moved slightly, almost a smile. "Corporate management? Logistics. That explains the optimism." Ethan shot him a look but changed his grip when Caleb demonstrated. The weight settled more comfortably. An hour later, Caleb quietly divided the remaining loads into smaller stacks and started carrying them beside him. He never mentioned it. When they finally stopped near sunset, Ethan found a cold bottle of water and a wrapped sandwich sitting on the edge of the porch where he had left his gloves. Caleb was already walking back toward the barn. "You leave this." Without turning, Caleb raised one hand. Ethan looked at the food, then at the farmhouse and the fields beyond it. He told himself he only had to make this work until another company called. For some reason, Caleb Mercer already seemed determined to make sure he lasted that long. By 6 the next morning, Ethan had learned that farms did not care whether he had slept badly. Caleb was already outside when Ethan entered the kitchen, dressed in the same practical uniform of faded jeans, work boots, and a work shirt. A mug sat beside the coffee pot. Ethan poured himself a cup and took one sip. "No sugar?" Caleb asked from the doorway. "No." Caleb nodded once, as if filing the information away. "Barn in 10. The next several days developed a rhythm Ethan could understand, even if the work inside that rhythm refused to cooperate with his preference for predictability. He wanted lists. Caleb gave him priorities. He wanted to know what they would be doing after lunch. Caleb looked at the sky and said, "Depends. On what?" "Everything." Ethan hated that answer. He hated even more that Caleb was usually right. Weather changed the order of jobs. Equipment demanded attention without consulting Ethan's schedule. Small problems appeared in places he had not known existed. Caleb moved through all of it with an irritating calm, while Ethan followed, asked questions, made notes on his phone, and tried not to look as inexperienced as he felt. His hands betrayed him first. By the 3rd morning, blisters had formed beneath his fingers. Ethan said nothing. Caleb noticed anyway. During a break beside the barn, he tossed Ethan a pair of work gloves. Ethan caught them. "I have gloves." "You have thin gloves." "They're fine." "They're bleeding through." Ethan looked down. Caleb was right. Again, he pulled on the heavier pair without thanking him. Caleb's mouth twitched. "You're welcome." Later that afternoon, Ethan nearly created a much bigger problem. Caleb had shown him how to secure a piece of irrigation equipment before repositioning it. Ethan understood the sequence, or thought he did. Wanting to prove he could handle one simple task without supervision, he moved too quickly and reached for the wrong connection. "Stop!" Caleb's voice was sharp enough that Ethan froze. Caleb crossed the distance between them, shut the system down properly, and looked at Ethan. Ethan's stomach dropped. "How bad? Could have damaged the fitting. Could have. You stopped. Because you stopped me." Caleb crouched beside the connection. "Come here." Ethan expected anger. Instead, Caleb walked him through the sequence again, slower this time, making Ethan repeat each step. When they finished, Ethan said, most employers would probably decide this experiment isn't working. Most employers have someone else standing around who knows how to do it." Ethan looked toward the empty yard. Fair point. But over the following days, that explanation became harder to believe. Caleb could have given him repetitive beginner tasks and checked on him occasionally. Instead, he kept Ethan beside him. He explained why jobs were done in certain orders, corrected Ethan's grip on tools, and made him redo things until he understood rather than merely obeyed. Ethan began catching Caleb watching for the moment his frustration peaked. And Caleb remembered things. The next morning, Ethan found coffee waiting without sugar. When his hands hurt, the heavier gloves appeared before he asked. When Caleb noticed him favoring his shoulders after a long afternoon, their final task somehow became one that required less lifting. None of it was dramatic enough to question. Together, though, the details were becoming difficult not to notice. At night, Ethan returned to the guest room and opened his laptop beside the bags he still had not unpacked. He sent applications to logistics companies, adjusted his resume and search job listings until the farm outside the window disappeared into darkness. That was the plan. The farm was temporary. Caleb was temporary. One evening, an application form asked when he could begin. Immediately, Ethan typed. Then he paused. Through the window, he could see Caleb crossing the yard toward the barn, finishing one last task alone. Ethan stared at the screen for a moment before pressing submit. The next morning, Caleb handed him his coffee and said, "You're with me today." Ethan took the mug. He was beginning to wonder why Caleb always seemed to want him there. Ethan stopped counting the days by how sore he was. Somewhere during his second week at Mercer Farm, his body began cooperating with the work. His hands still carried rough patches beneath Caleb's heavier gloves, and his shoulders still complained at night, but he no longer woke wondering which muscle would betray him first. More importantly, Caleb had stopped repeating every instruction. That felt strangely satisfying. One morning, they were preparing equipment and supplies for work across two sections of the farm when Ethan watched Caleb make his third trip between the barn and storage area. "There has to be a better way to do this." Caleb kept walking. "There usually is. You're carrying things back and forth that we could stage once." That made Caleb stop. Ethan recognized the expression immediately. It was the same one Caleb used whenever Ethan tried applying office logic to farm work. "Don't say it," Ethan warned. "I didn't say anything. Your face did." Caleb folded his arms. "All right, logistics. Show me." Ethan did. He reorganized the order in which they gathered what they needed, grouping supplies by where they would actually use them instead of where they happened to be stored. Caleb challenged two parts of the plan because Ethan had ignored how the work would change later in the day. Ethan adjusted rather than arguing. By afternoon, they had eliminated several unnecessary trips. Caleb looked across the work area, then at Ethan. "What? Nothing. That's not nothing." Caleb picked up a tool. "You were right." Ethan stared at him. "Could you repeat that?" "No, I'd like it recorded. You're ruining the moment." Ethan laughed before he could stop himself. Caleb did too. Changed something. Not dramatically. Caleb did not suddenly become talkative, and Ethan did not forget that he was still sleeping in a guest room with most of his belongings packed. But the silences between them stopped feeling like empty space. They became comfortable. That evening, they finished later than expected. Ethan was securing the last of the equipment when Caleb could easily have gone inside. Instead, Caleb stayed. "You know I can finish this," Ethan said. "I know." Ethan glanced at him. "Then why are you still here?" Caleb leaned against the nearby post. "Making sure logistics doesn't reorganize the entire farm overnight. You'd thank me eventually." "Unlikely." Ethan smiled and returned to the task. When he finished, neither man immediately moved toward the house. They ended up on the porch with a late meal, the fields dark beyond the yard and the air cooler than it had been when Ethan arrived. Caleb sat beside him, close enough that Ethan was increasingly aware of the space between their shoulders. He tried not to examine why. Instead, he asked, "Why didn't you hire someone who actually knew what he was doing?" Caleb looked over. "I'm serious. I showed up in sneakers. I remember. I almost damaged your irrigation equipment. I remember that too. You had to teach me everything." "Not everything." Ethan waited. Caleb took another bite, apparently believing that was an answer. "That's it. You learn fast." Ethan studied him. "That still sounds like a terrible hiring strategy." "Maybe I like terrible strategies." There was something in Caleb's expression Ethan could not quite read. Before Ethan could push, his phone vibrated against the porch beside him. He picked it up. The email was from a logistics company he had applied to 3 nights earlier. They had reviewed his resume and wanted to discuss a possible position. For 11 days, Ethan had imagined receiving exactly that message. He should have felt relief. Instead, he became conscious of Caleb sitting beside him and of how quiet the farm suddenly seemed. "Good news?" Caleb asked. Ethan locked the screen. "Maybe. A company wants to talk." Caleb nodded. "That's good." "Yeah." It was. Of course it was. Ethan had come here because his real life had fallen apart. The whole point was to earn some money, survive the gap, and leave when something better appeared. Yet later, lying in the guest room with the email open again, Ethan found himself thinking about Caleb staying outside when there had been no reason to stay. He read the company's message twice. Then he looked at his still-packed bags against the wall. For the first time since arriving, getting out of Mercer Farm no longer felt exactly like the same thing as moving forward. The email was still waiting when Ethan woke the next morning. He read it once before getting dressed, then left his phone on the guest room dresser and went downstairs. Caleb was already in the kitchen. "Coffee." Ethan accepted the mug. "No sugar." Caleb studied him for half a second longer than usual. "You look tired." "Good morning to you too." That wasn't an insult. "With you, I'm learning to check." Caleb almost smiled. "We've got a long day." The warning proved accurate. A problem with the farm's irrigation setup had disrupted work in one section, forcing them to spend hours shifting equipment, checking connections, and getting everything back into working order. It was exactly the kind of day Ethan would once have considered chaotic. Now he simply followed Caleb into it. They divided tasks without discussing every step. Ethan anticipated what Caleb would need and moved supplies before being asked. When one approach failed, Caleb adjusted and Ethan adjusted with him. By late afternoon, both men were dirty, exhausted, and too stubborn to stop before the work was finished. Ethan was carrying equipment back toward the work area when his boots slipped on uneven ground. He caught himself before falling, but his forearm scraped hard against a rough metal edge. "Damn!" Caleb was beside him almost immediately. "What happened?" "Nothing." Caleb looked at the blood beginning to surface along the scrape. "That's an interesting definition of nothing." "It's a scratch." "Let me see." Ethan instinctively pulled his arm back. "Caleb." "Ethan." Something in Caleb's tone ended the argument. The scrape was shallow, more painful than dangerous. Caleb checked it carefully, then looked toward the remaining work. "We're done." "We're not." "We are for today." "There's still..." "It'll be there tomorrow." Ethan stared at him. Caleb had spent the entire day refusing to let inconvenience dictate the work. Now a minor scrape had apparently rewritten the schedule. "I'm fine." "I know." "Then why are you looking at me like I lost an arm?" Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. "Come inside." The farmhouse kitchen felt unnaturally quiet after the noise of the day. Ethan sat while Caleb retrieved basic first aid supplies. The scrape had already stopped bleeding, and Ethan could easily have cleaned it himself. Neither of them mentioned that. Caleb stood close, one hand supporting Ethan's wrist while the other cleaned the dirt from the abrasion. Ethan flinched. "Sorry. You're not." "No," that made Ethan laugh softly. Then Caleb looked up. The laugh disappeared. They were too close. Ethan became aware of Caleb's fingers around his wrist, warm and steady, and of the concentration in his face. Caleb's concern had always arrived disguised as practical things: water, gloves, easier work, coffee made correctly. This did not feel practical anymore. Caleb finished cleaning the scrape but did not release him immediately. Ethan did not pull away. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Caleb's thumb shifted once against the inside of Ethan's wrist. Small, deliberate enough that Ethan felt it everywhere. Caleb released him. "That should be fine." Ethan looked down at his treated forearm. "Told you." Caleb began putting the supplies away. "You always this dramatic when an employee gets scratched?" Caleb stopped. Ethan regretted the question almost immediately. When Caleb turned, his expression had closed again. "You're staying in my house. You get hurt working for me. I make sure you're okay." Reasonable. Professional. Exactly the answer Ethan should have wanted. "Right?" Ethan said. That night, back in the guest room, he found another email waiting. The logistics company wanted a formal interview. Ethan stared at the invitation while the dull ache in his forearm reminded him of Caleb's hand around his wrist. 2 weeks earlier, he would have accepted before finishing the first sentence. His thumb hovered over the screen. Outside, footsteps crossed the porch below his window. "Caleb." Ethan closed the email when the footsteps stopped. He could still feel that brief movement of Caleb's thumb against his skin. The farm had been supposed to fill the space between losing one life and getting it back. Now Ethan was beginning to understand the problem. It no longer felt like empty space. The next morning, Ethan accepted the interview. He did it before going downstairs, standing beside the same bags he still had not unpacked. The company offered a time 2 days later for an initial video interview, followed by an in-person meeting if that went well. Ethan confirmed the appointment. He should have felt settled afterward. Instead, he spent breakfast wondering whether Caleb would notice. Caleb noticed something. By mid-morning, Ethan had twice missed instructions he normally would have caught immediately. "You planning to tell me what's distracting you?" Caleb asked. They were working near the barn, and Ethan kept his attention on the task in front of him. "Nothing's distracting me. You nearly put that in the wrong place." I caught it. Ethan exhaled. "I have an interview." Caleb went still for barely a second. Then he nodded. "The company that emailed you?" "Yeah." "When?" 2 days. "That's good." The words came easily. Everything after them changed. Caleb did not become rude. He did not stop speaking to Ethan or treat him differently enough that Ethan could accuse him of anything specific. He simply stopped choosing him. When they separated tasks, Caleb took one side of the work and gave Ethan the other. When Ethan finished, Caleb found something else that could be done independently. The easy conversation from the previous week vanished beneath practical instructions. By late afternoon, Ethan had had enough. Caleb was putting equipment away when Ethan followed him into the barn. "Did I do something?" Caleb glanced over. "What?" "You've barely spoken to me since this morning. We've been working together for 2 weeks. I know what that looks like." Caleb turned back to the equipment. "You have an interview. I figured you had things on your mind. That doesn't explain you." "There's nothing to explain." Ethan felt irritation rise faster than it should have. "Yesterday you practically shut down the farm because I scratched my arm." His forearm was still marked, the abrasion clean and beginning to heal. "You were hurt. I was scratched. You were bleeding. And today you can barely stand next to me." Caleb's shoulders tightened. Ethan stepped closer. "Why do you care if I leave?" Caleb finally faced him. "Because you came here needing work. That's not an answer. It's the one I have. No, it's the safe one. Silence settled between them. Ethan knew he was pushing. He also knew he could stop. He did not. You remember how I take my coffee. You know when my hands hurt before I say anything. You stay when I don't need help. Yesterday you held my wrist like... He stopped. Caleb's expression changed. Like what? Ethan's pulse kicked harder. You tell me. For several seconds, Caleb said nothing. Then, quietly, you should take the interview. Ethan stared at him. That's what you have to say? It's what you came here for. Another job. Your old life back. You think I forgot? No. Then why does it sound like you're trying to get rid of me? Caleb stepped closer. I'm trying not to give you a reason to make the wrong decision. The anger left Ethan almost as quickly as it had come. What reason? Caleb looked at him, and for once there was no practical task to hide behind. Ethan understood before Caleb answered. Maybe that was why Caleb never did. Ethan closed the remaining distance first. The kiss was brief. It was also unmistakably mutual. Caleb's hand came to Ethan's side as Ethan caught the front of Caleb's work shirt. There was no stumble, no accident. Nothing either of them could blame on exhaustion. When they separated, Caleb stayed close enough that Ethan could feel his breath. Neither spoke. Ethan's fingers were still curled into Caleb's shirt. Caleb looked down at them, then back at Ethan. I don't regret that. Relief hit Ethan so sharply it almost hurt. Then Caleb continued. But you cannot decide what happens to your life because we kissed once on this farm. Ethan released his shirt. You think that's what I'm doing? I think you lost your job 11 days before you came here. I think you arrived with your whole life packed in bags you still haven't unpacked. And I think you deserve to know what you want when you're not choosing from panic. Ethan had no immediate answer. Caleb stepped back. The distance felt different now because Ethan knew exactly what had occupied it. So what happens? Ethan asked. Caleb's gaze held his. You take the interview. And us? Something vulnerable crossed Caleb's face before disappearing. I don't know. For the first time, Ethan believed him. That evening, he sat on the farmhouse porch alone with his interview confirmation open on his phone. The question that had followed him for days was finally answered. Caleb wanted him, but that answer had opened a harder one. If Caleb asked him to stay, Ethan no longer knew whether he would be strong enough to leave. And if Caleb never asked, Ethan was beginning to fear how much he might want to stay anyway. The kiss did not disappear the next morning. That was the first thing Ethan understood when he walked into the kitchen and found Caleb standing beside the coffee pot. His mug was waiting. No sugar. Caleb looked at him. Morning. Nothing else happened. That was almost worse. They worked together when the job required it, but Caleb no longer invented reasons to remain beside Ethan. The unnecessary proximity Ethan had only recently learned to recognize was gone. Caleb was not cold. He was careful. By the time Ethan sat down for his video interview 2 days later, the scrape on his forearm had faded into a healing mark, and the distance between them had become impossible to ignore. The interview went well. Ethan knew it before the call ended. The questions were familiar. Transportation schedules, workflow problems, vendor coordination, operational pressure. For 40 minutes, he became the version of himself he had been afraid unemployment had erased. He was still good at this. When the interviewer said they wanted to move him forward quickly, Ethan felt something he had been waiting weeks to feel. Validation. Then he closed the laptop and realized Caleb was the person he wanted to tell. He found him outside. They want another interview. Caleb looked genuinely pleased. I told you they would. You absolutely did not. I thought it. Ethan smiled despite himself. Caleb smiled back. For 1 second, they were standing inside the easy rhythm they had built before the kiss. Then Caleb stepped away. I need to finish up near the barn. I can help. I've got it. The words landed harder than they should have. That evening, Ethan learned the company wanted to bring him into the city for a final meeting. The position was close enough to his previous work that he could picture himself doing it immediately. He should have been excited. Instead, he spent the next morning trying not to watch Caleb avoid being alone with him. Near midday, Ethan was carrying supplies toward the barn when he heard Caleb on the phone discussing upcoming staffing. Ethan would have kept walking if one phrase had not stopped him. "No, I already told him I wouldn't need him." Caleb turned and saw Ethan. The call ended shortly afterward. Ethan set down what he was carrying. "Who wouldn't you need?" Caleb's expression told him immediately that the answer mattered. "Someone who'd asked about work." "When?" "A while ago." "How long is a while?" Caleb looked toward the barn. Ethan waited. "After you started." The answer settled slowly. "Experienced." "Yes." Ethan stared at him. "You had an experienced farm worker available?" "He had other options." "That wasn't my question." "No." "And you turned him down." Caleb said nothing. Ethan stepped closer. "Why?" "You were doing fine. I almost broke your irrigation equipment." "You didn't." "I showed up knowing nothing. And then you learned." Ethan shook his head. "You could have replaced me." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Yes." The word changed the shape of the past 2 weeks. The gloves, the lessons, the extra time, the evenings when Caleb had stayed after Ethan no longer needed him. "You kept me." "Anyway." Caleb met his eyes. "Yes." "Why?" This time Caleb did not retreat behind the job. "Because I wanted you here." Ethan's breath caught. There it was. Not another kiss. Not an accident disguised as concern. A choice. "Then ask me to stay." Caleb's expression changed immediately. "No," Ethan almost laughed from disbelief. "You just told me you wanted me here." "I do. And I'm giving you the easiest opportunity you're ever going to get." "That's exactly why I won't." Ethan stepped back. Caleb continued before he could turn away. "You finally have another real option. You know you can go back and do the work you were good at. If I ask you to give that up now, how are you supposed to know whether you stayed because you chose this or because you chose me when you were scared of losing both?" Ethan looked at him. "You don't get to decide that for me." "I know." "Then stop pushing me away." "I'm not pushing you away. It feels exactly like it." Caleb's voice softened. "I'm trying to make sure the door is open." That hurt more, because Ethan understood. His city job was no longer merely proof that someone would hire him again. It had become a real future waiting on one side. Caleb stood on the other. And for the first time since Ethan had arrived at Mercer Farm, neither unemployment nor necessity was making the decision for him. By the following morning, the open door Caleb had insisted on giving Ethan had become real. The company called before breakfast. They wanted Ethan in the city for the final meeting. If everything went as expected, they were prepared to move quickly. Ethan stood in the guest room afterward, phone still in his hand, looking at the bags against the wall. He had never unpacked them. For weeks, that had been proof that Mercer Farm was temporary. Now it felt like an accusation. When Ethan entered the kitchen, Caleb looked up from his coffee. They called. Caleb waited. "Final interview. In the city." "When?" "Tomorrow." Caleb nodded slowly. "Okay." Ethan hated how calm he sounded. "That's it. What do you want me to say?" Ethan almost answered. "Ask me to stay." Instead, he said, "Nothing." They worked through the morning with a quiet efficiency that made everything worse. Ethan knew the routines now. He no longer needed Caleb to explain every task or correct every movement. Near midday, Caleb told him replacement help had been arranged for the upcoming workload. Ethan stopped what he was doing. "So you don't need me?" "That's not what I said." "It's what it means." Caleb faced him. "It means you can go to your interview without worrying about what happens here." There it was again. Freedom. Ethan had spent weeks wanting it, and Caleb kept handing him more. By evening, Ethan's final work was finished. Inside the farmhouse, Caleb paid him everything he was owed. Ethan looked at the amount, then at him. "You really planned this." "I knew the interview might move fast." "You made sure there was nothing keeping me here." Caleb's gaze held his. "Nothing that should." Ethan felt anger rise, but beneath it was something much more frightening. "You said you wanted me here. I do. Then say it. Caleb went still. Ethan stepped closer. Ask me to stay. For a moment Ethan thought he might. Instead, Caleb shook his head. No, the single word hurt more than Ethan expected. Why? Because losing your job brought you here. Because you needed money, and a room, and somewhere to land when everything else disappeared. Caleb's voice remained quiet. I'm not going to use the fact that you care about me to make staying feel like another thing you have to do. You don't know what staying feels like to me. You're right. Then let me decide. I am. Caleb looked toward the hallway leading to Ethan's room. Go to the interview. Ethan swallowed. And if I don't come back? Something moved across Caleb's face before he controlled it. Then I'll know you chose what you wanted. That easy? No, Caleb's answer came immediately. Not easy at all. That was the closest Ethan was going to get. The next morning he carried his bags outside. The same bags he had brought when he arrived, convinced that the farm was only a temporary stop between losing one life and recovering it. His forearm scrape had almost completely healed. Caleb stood beside the porch while Ethan loaded everything into his car. Neither man pretended there was another practical reason to delay. When Ethan closed the trunk, Caleb said, "You've got everything?" Ethan looked toward the farmhouse, then the barn, then the fields where he had spent weeks becoming useful in ways he had never expected. Yeah. Caleb nodded. Ethan waited one last time. Caleb did not ask. So Ethan got into the car. He drove down the gravel entrance and onto the road without looking back until the farm had nearly disappeared behind him. Then he glanced in the mirror. Caleb was still standing where Ethan had left him. For the first time since losing his job, Ethan had somewhere else he could go. And for the first time since arriving at Mercer Farm, there was absolutely nothing forcing him to return. The city looked exactly the way Ethan remembered it. Traffic moved in impatient bursts. Glass buildings reflected the pale morning sky. People crossed intersections carrying coffee and laptops, dressed for jobs whose responsibilities could be explained without mentioning weather, irrigation, or whether a pair of gloves was thick enough to protect blistered hands. Ethan parked, changed into the interview clothes he had brought with him, and entered the building. For the next hour, he did not think about Mercer Farm. He answered questions about transportation networks and scheduling conflicts. He studied hypothetical problems and explained how he would solve them. When they challenged one of his answers, he defended it calmly. Nothing about the work felt foreign. That mattered. By the end of the meeting, Ethan could see recognition in the interviewers' faces. They did not see a man whose career had collapsed. They saw someone competent, someone valuable, someone they could hire. Walking back to his car, Ethan felt lighter than he had since the morning he had been called into a 9-minute meeting and handed a cardboard box. He had wanted proof that losing his job had not erased who he was. Now he had it, and somehow having it made the decision clearer. Ethan sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. He thought about the job he could return to. Then he thought about Caleb refusing to ask him to stay. Not because Caleb did not want him, because he did. Because Caleb had understood something Ethan had been avoiding since he arrived at the farm with his belongings packed for departure. Staying could not mean failing to leave. It had to mean choosing where to go. Ethan started the car. By the time Mercer Farm appeared ahead of him, the sun was lower and his pulse was beating hard enough to make him grip the steering wheel tighter. Caleb was near the barn when Ethan pulled into the gravel yard. He stopped moving. For several seconds, neither man did anything. Then Caleb walked toward the car as Ethan climbed out. What happened? Ethan closed the door. Hello to you too. The interview. It went well. Caleb frowned. Then why are you here? Ethan had imagined this moment for most of the drive. None of the answers he had rehearsed survived Caleb standing in front of him. Nothing went wrong. Caleb stared at him. They liked me, Ethan continued. I was good in there. I remembered that I'm still good at that work. That's good. It is. Caleb's expression became guarded. Ethan, I went because you were right. That stopped him. I needed to know I could leave. Ethan stepped closer. I needed to know I wasn't staying because I was unemployed, or because I was scared nobody else wanted me, or because this was the only place I had. Caleb said nothing. Ethan looked toward the farmhouse, then back at him. When I came here, I needed the job. I needed the room. I needed you to give me a chance when I had no idea what I was doing. His voice lowered. I don't need those things anymore. Pain flickered across Caleb's face. Ethan almost smiled. You really need to let people finish. Caleb blinked. I came back because I wanted to. The guarded expression disappeared. Ethan closed the last step between them. Nobody forced me here this time. Caleb looked at him as if he was afraid to misunderstand. What are you choosing? You. Ethan let the word settle. And this place. Not because I suddenly think logistics means nothing. I'm actually pretty useful when you stop insulting it. A breath of laughter escaped Caleb. Ethan continued. I don't know exactly what my work looks like 6 months from now. Maybe there are things here I can help you do better. Maybe there are things I still need to figure out. But I know I don't want to go back to my old life just because it's familiar. Caleb's eyes stayed on his. And I'm not asking for my temporary job back. Good. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Good. Caleb stepped closer until almost no space remained between them. Because I don't want you here as my temporary farmhand. What do you want? This time Caleb did not hide behind silence. My partner. Ethan's breath caught. Caleb touched his face, giving him every opportunity to move away. Ethan leaned into the touch instead. And just so we're clear, Caleb said, I mean that in the way that makes the employment paperwork considerably more complicated. Ethan laughed. Then he kissed him. There was nothing uncertain about this kiss. No argument behind it. No interview waiting to determine what it meant. No temporary arrangement either man could use as an excuse. When they separated, Ethan kept his forehead against Caleb's. My bags are still in the car. Caleb smiled. You planning to bring them inside? Ethan looked past him toward the farmhouse. The first time he had carried those bags through that door, he had been counting the days until he could carry them back out. This time, the choice belonged entirely to him. Yeah, Ethan said. I am. Several weeks later, Ethan stood in the barn studying a supply list that would once have made absolutely no sense to him. Now it only made partial nonsense. He considered that progress. You ordered too much of this last time, he said. Caleb looked over from the workbench. We used it. Eventually. That's not the same thing. You've been here a few weeks and already think you run the place. No. If I ran the place, I'd know what half of these things are called. Caleb smiled and returned to what he was doing. Ethan adjusted the order. He had not abandoned logistics. That had surprised him most. Instead, he had begun seeing places where the skills from his old career actually belonged here. Organizing supplies, planning deliveries, reducing unnecessary trips, making parts of the farm run more efficiently. Caleb listened when Ethan knew more. Ethan listened when Caleb did. There was still plenty Ethan did not know, and Caleb remained irritatingly pleased whenever the farm reminded him of that fact. But Ethan was learning. More importantly, they were learning how to work together without pretending that work was the only reason they wanted to be near each other. When Ethan finished the list, Caleb passed behind him and rested a hand briefly against his lower back. The touch was casual now. Ordinary. Ethan loved that more than he expected. That evening, he returned to the guest room, although neither of them called it that very often anymore, and stopped in the doorway. The bags were gone from the wall. Not gone entirely. Unpacked. His clothes occupied drawers. His laptop sat on the desk instead of disappearing into a bag every night. The small pieces of his life that he had kept ready for departure had finally found places in the room. Caleb appeared behind him. You finally did it. Ethan glanced back. Did what? Unpacked. Apparently I'm capable of personal growth. I was starting to wonder. Ethan turned and leaned against the doorframe. Caleb looked into the room, then at him. So how long are you planning to stay? Weeks earlier, the question would have terrified Ethan. Back then, staying had sounded like failure. like admitting he could not get his old life back. Now he knew better, not because the farm had magically solved everything, and not because Caleb had rescued him from a life he no longer wanted. Ethan had gone back. He had stood inside that old world and discovered he could still belong there. Then he had chosen where he wanted to belong instead. He reached for Caleb's hand. Caleb let their fingers interlace. Ethan looked once at the empty space where his packed bags had waited from his first night on the farm. Then he smiled. "This time," he said, "I didn't pack for leaving." Caleb's expression softened. He pulled Ethan gently toward him, and Ethan went willingly. Outside, there was still work waiting for tomorrow. Inside, for the first time since losing his job, Ethan was exactly where he had chosen to be.